Thank you, Elizabeth, for sitting down with me today.
You're welcome.
We're here in Guelph, Ontario for the 2018 meeting of the National Association of Plant Breeders. The NAPB is often thought of as an American organization, but it's not true. It has a Canadian component. You're actually one of the founding members. You're on the first executive. You're based here in Guelph, Ontario. You're a Canadian. Can you describe for me a little bit about the NAPB in general, its purpose, and just talk a little bit about the fact that it has both an American and Canadian component to it?
Sure. The history of NAPB, it actually, this has been our 8th meeting being billed as NAPB. And NAPB actually was an organization that was, it came out of what's called an experiment station subcommittee of the USDA, where a bunch of primarily US-based plant breeders had kind of self-organized starting back in 2005, and had realized that they didn't really have much of a voice, and they wanted to, as a group, have a greater voice. And so there were a couple of meetings that I wasn't part of that had occurred. One had occurred in 2005, and one I think a couple years later. And out of those initial 2 meetings, that's when this experiment station subcommittee was formed, and that was referred to as SC 080, I believe. And then they slowly morphed into what's now called PBCC, the Plant Breeding Coordinating Committee. And it's these experiment station committees, subcommittees, have to have a purpose. And the initial purpose of PBCC was to actually create NAPB. So the origins of NAPB were certainly based in the States, but the people that were sitting around the table weren't necessarily just US-based plant breeders. And I'm not exactly sure how I got myself into the position of being on the first board, but it was basically nobody else had volunteered, and they twisted my arm and I said yes. And I made the mistake of coming on as secretary, which held me to a 4-year commitment as you kind of move up the executive ladder. So yeah, I was there for the first 4 years of NAPB, and we went through a strategic planning exercise because as you kind of age as a organization early on, you do run the risk of, as those initial founders and active members move away from the executive roles, you might lose momentum. And we'd gone through a strategic planning exercise in partnership with PBCC, and I think that really set the groundwork for sustaining that momentum and building that momentum. And 8 years is we've had a good run so far, and a lot more momentum's been built, and they're starting to talk about another strategic planning exercise and moving forward. There's a colleague in NAPB who claims that a passport's one of the greatest tools a plant breeder can have, and we're maybe paraphrasing some of what he said, but we thought it might be interesting to try to bring it across the border, the meeting across the border, and the 2 obvious places were either Guelph or Saskatoon, and we ended up with Guelph being the first location of the Canadian-based meeting of NAPB, and I suspect that Saskatoon is going to be up on the radar pretty shortly as another destination for the meeting. Next year they're down in Georgia. We like to move these meetings around. You pick up new members that way. Hopefully we've picked up far more Canadian members now that we've come north of the border. And hopefully they'll become active and continue to not only attend meetings, but start to participate in some of the other organizational activities. So by moving around, we get to experience different crops, which was another good reason to bring it up to Canada. And I think this morning's session, for example, we highlighted some of the Canadian breeding operations, particularly out towards Western Canada.
Well, I heard last night that the membership of the NAPB is actually higher now than it's ever been, which is great. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how it's been so successful?
Well, the person that's really, well, there's been two people I think that have really driven this. Don Cummings was the NAPB member that first kind of pushed the membership committee to start charging membership fees, and he was committed to driving that. And then Hannah, and for the life of me, Hannah's last name escapes me right now, but she's really kind of picked up where Don left off and has been Hannah Senior there, finally. But Hannah Senior has really pushed, and so I think those two people really deserve a lot of credit.
How many members now? Do you know the exact?
I believe I heard over 400.
Wow.
So that's a really impressive number. Yeah.
For you personally, can you tell me a little bit about your work in particular? I understand you work in a number of different crops, both professionally and for fun on the side. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I'm primarily a corn breeder, corn geneticist, and corn is a little bit different than most of the other crop species in that there's an incredibly well-funded commercial enterprise that has the resources and the manpower. And so as an academic, your role is a little bit different than some of the other plant breeders. Now I have the advantage of being a corn breeder on what I call the fringes of the corn breeding world, that being the extremely short season. So we actually still really develop inbred lines. Those inbred lines some have ended up in commercial hybrids. There's a couple that are currently under evaluation to be picked up. Fingers crossed something comes of that. So I still have an active breeding program, but we also do an awful lot of research around the physiology of grain yield, the genetics that controls that physiology, and looking to figure out where our next avenue of substantial genetic gain might come from, more from a physiological perspective. So corn is, the sevenfold increase we've seen in corn in the last 70 to 80 years is primarily due to increased plant population tolerance, and we've doubled densities, or more than doubled densities. That approach is probably coming close to an end because we're already at maximum light interception for the most part. So now we have to start thinking about what other aspects can we exploit. And so those are some of the things my research program is exploring. We're also starting to work on Goss's wilt, which is a problem out in Manitoba. It's not a disease in Ontario yet. It's certainly just a matter of time before it ends up here. It's coming either from Manitoba or up through the States.
I understand for fun you like to breed roses, and you're also a beekeeper. That's pretty neat.
So I've been breeding roses as a hobby for probably, I'm going to say, about 10 years now. It started out as more of a curiosity because the old Canadian Explorer roses were incredibly winter hardy, and I remember walking out in the garden after the first winter and just being stunned at the fact that there's hardly any cane dieback on some of those classic Canadian Explorer roses, whereas your, hybrid teas and everything, they were pretty much dead and they weren't coming back. And as a geneticist, that just kind of intrigued me, and I guess I just started kind of messing around, and the hobby's gotten a little out of control within the last year. I've got way too many rose seedlings to deal with right now. But along the way, I'm co-advising a grad student that I share with Daryl Summer out of Vineland. That's a rose breeding grad student. So it's the knowledge that I've gained on the hobby is actually helping me out now professionally as an advisor anyway. The beekeeping thing, well, I've kind of been fascinated by that for a few years, and I've been trying to get into the short course at the University of Guelph for a few years. And I successfully got in last winter and took their 2-day short course. And so this is my first season I'm not sure I'm a beekeeper yet. I have bees. If I can get them through the winter, I'll call myself a beekeeper. That's
one of the challenges I know of keeping bees, of course.
Yeah, and I'm on the steep part of the learning curve right now. There's a lot more that I don't know and a lot more to learn about keeping bees than I probably realize. Well, I actually realize it, and that's a little scary, I think.
Well, that's some good advice for life in general, is to know when you don't know everything. And the theme this year of the meeting is training the next generation of plant breeders. Looking back on your career, if you could talk to a younger Elizabeth Lee who was just starting out in her career, what would your advice be to that young plant breeder?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm going to flip this answer around to a slightly different question, I guess. So I've spent the last, 6 months, I've been asked a few times by undergrads or grad students of, how I ended up where I ended up. And I said, well, I first wanted to be a veterinarian. And so I was in animal science, and I had to take basic biology, and I got a C in biology, and I had to take zoology, and I got a D in zoology. And so it was very clear I was not going to get into vet school. And so my comfort zone, having grown up on a seed farm, was agronomy. And I thought, well, I might as well go into something I'm comfortable with. It's going to be easy. And then that was my first year. And the fall of the second year, I decided, I haven't really spent my free time all that well. I might as well go out and get a part-time job on campus. And so I applied for and interviewed for 2 jobs. And one of them was in a corn genetics lab. And then the other one was in an animal science lab, and it was collecting bull semen. And I'm really grateful that I got the job in the maize genetics lab, because that really changed my career trajectory. I'm not sure where I would have ended up had I gotten the job in the bull semen lab. And so I tell this to students as a way of saying, there's going to be crossroads that you encounter. You don't realize them at the time that they're a major crossroad until later in life when you kind of reflect back on that. And so, there's all these unknowns in life, and that's just part of life.
So I guess just one last question following on the theme of young people and interacting with them here at NAPB. Is there one particular piece of advice that you've passed on to them, having interacted, especially with the 8 Borlaug scholars this year?
I was talking with a colleague, I guess it was yesterday, about students in general, and we were saying, that we're realizing that there's more to life than just working, and we have to also kind of acknowledge that the times have changed. There's far more stresses. The profession of plant breeding's changed, and that maybe we need to start thinking about the expectations we have of our grad students working 5 days a week or 7 days a week or 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just because we did that in grad school shouldn't necessarily be the expectations that we have now. And that, there's more to life than just work. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge, I think, for our society in general, just because with technology now, we can do, or we think we can do, so much more, and we can be so productive with all these great tools, but
there are also a lot of stressors too, right? With that technology, you're constantly plugged in, and I think it's a lot more stressful than it used to be.
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth to that for sure, because you probably see maybe some burnout, people working a little too much, and maybe you need to take a deep breath and take a break sometimes.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.